The waitress sensed the driver's false hesitation and diverted the CEO before the ambush unfolded. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a crisp autumn evening in New York City. The streets were bustling with the usual rush of cars, pedestrians, and the hum of city life. Inside a luxury car, James Harrington, the billionaire CEO, was preparing for a high-stakes business meeting. He sat in the back of the sleek, black car, his mind focused on the negotiations ahead. He had no idea that his evening was about to take a sharp turn into danger. The driver, a man in his 40s, had been professional so far. He kept his eyes on the road, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror. But there was something off about the way he was driving tonight. It was subtle at first, a slight hesitation as the car approached an intersection. James didn't notice, lost in his thoughts about the potential deals he was about to close. But Lina, the waitress from a nearby restaurant, was waiting for her ride at the same intersection. She had finished her shift and was eager to get home after a long day. As she stood by the curb, she noticed the car slowing down unexpectedly. The hesitation was too deliberate, too practiced for it to be just a random traffic stop. She felt a strange shiver run down her spine. Something wasn't right. Her instincts kicked in, sharper than usual after years of observing the subtle movements of people around her. She had seen this before, in her own neighborhood, when things weren't as they seemed. As the car slowly rolled forward, Lina couldn't help but feel like the driver was giving away his intentions. She wasn't sure why, but she felt like she was witnessing something that was meant to stay hidden. Her gaze shifted to the CEO in the back seat. He seemed unaware of the danger that was slowly closing in. Her heart raced as she saw the driver make another small, deliberate movement, his hand hovering near a button on the dashboard. A moment of hesitation. Then it clicked for Lina. The driver was in on something shady, and James was the target. She couldn't just stand there. Lina's instincts screamed at her to act. Without thinking, she stepped forward, blocking the path of the car. The driver's eyes widened in surprise, and he quickly glanced at James in the back seat, as if waiting for some kind of approval. But James was still lost in his phone, unaware of the potential danger. Lina knocked on the window, her heart pounding as she locked eyes with the driver. "You need to turn left now," she said firmly, her voice calm but filled with authority. The driver hesitated for just a second, his gaze flicking nervously to the rearview mirror, but Lina stood her ground. She could feel the pressure building as the seconds ticked by. The moment stretched on, but finally, the driver obeyed her command. The car veered left sharply, breaking off from its original course. James barely noticed, still too absorbed in his phone to realize what had just happened. The driver made another sharp turn, now heading down a narrow alleyway. Lina felt the tension ease slightly, but she knew they weren't out of danger yet. Something about this didn't feel over. She had no idea what the driver had planned, but she wasn't going to take any chances. She glanced at James, who was still oblivious. He hadn't even noticed that the car had taken an entirely different route. The city lights flickered past them as the car sped down the alley. The feeling of danger was still in the air, and Lina couldn't shake the sensation that they were being followed. The car continued down the narrow alley, the tires screeching against the pavement as Lina's gut told her that they were still being followed. The lights from the street reflected off the sleek black SUV that trailed them, its headlights glinting ominously in the rearview mirror. The driver kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel tightly, his movements rigid. James, still oblivious, tapped away on his phone, unaware of the danger that had just been diverted. Lina's heart raced as she watched the SUV in the mirror, its presence unsettling. It had been too close for comfort, and she knew this wasn't over yet. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her, but she stayed calm. She had to. Her instincts had saved them so far, but she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep this up. "Keep going straight," she ordered, her voice steady. The driver didn't hesitate this time, obeying her command without question, but the SUV was still behind them, closing the distance. Lina's mind raced. If they didn't do something fast, they would be boxed in. The tension was suffocating, and her every sense was on high alert. "Turn here," she instructed, pointing toward a side street. The driver followed her lead again, and they veered off the main road, taking a sharp right turn. For a moment, it seemed like the SUV might lose them, but then the unmistakable sound of tires screeching echoed behind them. The chase was still on. Lina's grip tightened on the seat as she leaned forward, trying to think of a way to get them out of this mess. The last thing she wanted was for James to find out what was happening. He was supposed to be safe, but she knew better than anyone that in a world like his, nothing was guaranteed. James glanced up from his phone for the first time, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He had no idea what was going on, but he could feel the shift in the air. The car was moving too fast, turning too sharply, like it was trying to outrun something. His brow furrowed. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight with confusion. Lina didn't answer immediately. She couldn't afford to give him the full picture. "Not yet. We're just taking a detour," she said, her tone casual, though her mind was far from calm. "A detour?" James repeated, still not entirely convinced. "Where are we headed?" Lina hesitated, then turned her gaze to him. She needed him to trust her, but she also needed him to stay in the dark for his own safety. "Don't worry," she said quietly. "I'm getting you to safety." James leaned back in his seat, his thoughts still racing. He didn't like being out of control, but something about the woman in front of him made him want to trust her. Her confidence was disarming, and he found himself wondering if she had been in situations like this before. He glanced at her, noticing the way she was gripping the seat, her knuckles white. Her calm exterior didn't hide the tension in her posture. She wasn't just driving him to safety. She was protecting him. But from what? As the car sped down the darkened streets, Lina's mind was working overtime. The SUV was still behind them, just a few car lengths away. She had to lose them, but the city streets were narrow and winding. There was no easy way out. Then, in a split second, an idea came to her. "Hold on," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The driver didn't need any further explanation. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, and the car shot forward, its speed increasing rapidly. Lina glanced in the rearview mirror once more. The SUV was still there, but it wasn't gaining on them. For now, they had a small window of time. "Take the next left," she ordered, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The car turned sharply, and they were back on a familiar street, one that led to a quieter part of the city. Lina's plan was simple: take them off the main roads and into a residential area. It would be harder for the SUV to follow them through the winding streets and tight corners. But even as she thought it, she knew this wasn't over. The danger was real, and it wasn't going to just disappear. The next few minutes felt like an eternity as the car weaved through the streets, the SUV still tailing them, but never gaining ground. Lina glanced at James, who was staring out the window, his face a mix of confusion and concern. He had no idea what she was doing, but he could see the determination in her eyes. He had to trust her. He didn't have a choice. Just as the SUV seemed to fall behind, Lina made another sharp turn, heading into a quiet alleyway. This time, the SUV didn't follow. The alley was narrow, and the large vehicle couldn't maneuver through the tight corners. For a moment, Lina allowed herself to breathe, but she knew better than to think they were in the clear. She kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of movement. The alley was silent, but the tension in the air was palpable. James looked at her, his voice low. "What's going on, really?" he asked. Lina met his gaze, her expression serious. "You were being followed," she said, her voice calm but firm. "By who?" James asked, still trying to process everything. Lina didn't answer immediately. She knew the question was coming, but she wasn't ready to give him all the details just yet. "It's not important right now," she said finally. "What matters is that you're safe." James stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing with a million questions. But one thing was clear: Lina had just saved his life. The car slowed to a stop in the quiet alleyway, its engine purring as Lina scanned the surroundings. The SUV had not followed them down the tight path, and for a moment, there was silence. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, muffled by the tall buildings around them. Lina's heart was still racing, but she had to keep her composure. James, now fully alert, looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Why are we stopping here?" he asked, his voice low. Lina took a deep breath, her mind still processing everything that had just happened. "We need to make sure we're not being followed anymore," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "It's not safe to go back to the main roads just yet." James didn't argue. He trusted her, despite the chaos that had unfolded in the last few minutes. He had no idea why Lina had been so certain that they were in danger, but somehow, he knew she had been right. "I don't know what you saw back there," James said, his voice softer now, "but thank you. You just saved my life." Lina met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She had done what she had to do, but she wasn't looking for gratitude. "Just doing my job," she said quietly. "We're not out of danger yet." James didn't speak for a moment, processing her words. He had been caught off guard by everything, by the way Lina had acted so swiftly, so confidently. It was like she knew exactly what was happening, as if she had been trained for this. But there was something about her that didn't add up. She was a waitress, not a bodyguard or a trained security agent. And yet, she had acted with the precision of someone who had been in these kinds of situations before. "What's going on?" James asked finally, his curiosity piqued. "Who were those people? And why did they follow us?" Lina hesitated, glancing around once more to make sure they were alone. She had to be careful with what she said. She couldn't tell him everything, not yet. But she owed him at least an explanation. "They were after you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I don't know who they were, but they were targeting you. And I wasn't about to let them get away with it." James leaned back in his seat, his mind reeling. He was used to enemies, to rivals in business, but this was different. He had never been followed like this, never been in a situation where his life had been in immediate danger. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why would someone want to hurt me? I don't have enemies like that." Lina didn't answer immediately. She could see the confusion in his eyes, the disbelief. But the truth was, James had enemies. Everyone in his position did. It was just a matter of time before they made their move. "Trust me," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "People like you don't make it to the top without making enemies along the way. You just don't always see them coming." James didn't say anything, his mind still trying to process everything. He had spent his life building an empire, a network of influence, wealth, and power. But he had never considered the darker side of his success, the people who might want to bring him down. He had never thought that his life would be at risk because of it. "What now?" he asked, his voice tense. Lina glanced at the road ahead, her mind working quickly. "We're going to keep moving," she said, her tone resolute. "We can't stay here for long, but we'll figure out a safe way to get you back home." "And what about you?" James asked. "What's your plan?" Lina didn't hesitate. "I'll make sure you're safe. That's all that matters right now." She didn't want to admit it, but part of her was concerned. She didn't know who these people were, or why they had been after James. And more importantly, she didn't know what they would do next. But she had to keep him safe. It was her responsibility now. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone's protector. "Are you sure we're safe here?" James asked, his voice rising slightly. "For now," Lina replied, her eyes scanning the surroundings once more. She had to be sure. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She had already taken one risk by diverting them, and she wasn't about to take another. As she spoke, she heard the faint sound of footsteps behind them, distant but approaching. Her heart skipped a beat. "Get down," she ordered quickly. James didn't question her. He crouched low in his seat, and Lina did the same, her eyes glued to the side mirror. The footsteps grew louder, and Lina's pulse quickened. They weren't alone anymore. The danger wasn't over. It had just begun. The footsteps grew louder, echoing in the narrow alley. Lina's heart raced as she pressed herself against the car's seat, straining her ears to catch every sound. The air felt thick, heavy with the tension that hung between them. She could feel James's eyes on her, but she didn't dare glance at him. The footsteps were almost upon them. She could hear the shuffle of boots on the pavement, the soft hiss of breath in the cold night air. Lina's mind raced. Who were these people? Why were they following them? She had already diverted them once, but it seemed like there was no end to this. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. Her pulse quickened, and she could feel the heat rising in her chest. The danger was closing in. She knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. She had to make a move, but what could she do? If these were the same people who had been tailing them earlier, there was no way they would just leave. Her fingers hovered over the door handle, ready to act at a moment's notice. But just as quickly as the footsteps had appeared, they started moving away, retreating down the alley. Lina held her breath, listening for any sound that could give away their position. Silence. For a brief moment, it seemed like they were safe. But Lina wasn't fooled. It was too quiet. She waited, her body tense, as the seconds stretched on. Then, without warning, the silence was shattered by the roar of an engine. Lina's head snapped up. She didn't need to look. She knew what was happening. The same black SUV that had been following them was now speeding down the alley, heading straight toward their position. She cursed under her breath. They had found them again. She had no time to think, only to react. "Get down," she hissed to James, her voice sharp and urgent. James didn't hesitate this time. He ducked low in his seat, his body instinctively following her command. The SUV was closing in, its headlights cutting through the darkness, blinding them for a split second. Lina's mind raced, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know how much longer they could stay hidden. The alley was narrow, and they had no way of outrunning the SUV. She looked around quickly, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any escape. That's when she saw it. A fire escape ladder, hanging just above their heads, leading up to the roof of a nearby building. It was their only chance. "Up! Now!" Lina shouted. Without another word, she pulled herself out of the car and dashed toward the fire escape. James, still dazed by the sudden change in pace, followed her lead, scrambling out of the car and running behind her. The SUV's engine roared louder as it neared, but Lina didn't look back. She had one goal: get to the roof. The fire escape rattled under their weight as they climbed, each step bringing them closer to safety, but the sound of the SUV's tires screeching against the pavement told her they were still in pursuit. They had to move faster. Lina reached the top of the fire escape first, pulling herself over the railing and onto the roof. She didn't wait for James. She was already scanning the area for the next move. The city stretched out before her, its lights flickering in the distance. It was a vast expanse, but it felt strangely comforting to be so high up, away from the danger below. James reached the top a few seconds later, breathless but unharmed. "What now?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "We keep moving," Lina replied, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. She didn't look at him as she spoke. She couldn't afford to. Every moment was a risk, and the danger was still very real. She motioned for him to follow, and they began making their way across the rooftops, careful not to make too much noise. The city was alive beneath them, but up here, it felt like they were in another world. Lina didn't know how long they could keep this up, but she wasn't about to stop now. She had already risked everything to save James, and she wasn't going to let him down. "Stay close," she warned him. The last thing she needed was for him to panic. They made their way across the rooftops, moving swiftly but quietly. The lights of the city below them twinkled like distant stars, but it was impossible to forget the threat still looming behind them. The SUV could be anywhere, and they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. As they reached the edge of one rooftop, Lina paused, peering over the side to check for any movement below. There was nothing. The street was empty. She turned to James, her eyes meeting his. "We're not out of danger yet," she said, her voice low. "We need to get off these rooftops. There's a way down the other side." James nodded, his expression serious. He didn't need any more explanations. He trusted her completely now, more than he ever had before. Lina led the way down the fire escape on the other side of the building, their footsteps barely making a sound as they descended. The alley below them was quiet, but Lina wasn't ready to relax. They had to keep moving, keep staying one step ahead of whoever was after them. She had no idea who was behind this or why, but she knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to stop until they had James. And Lina was going to make sure that didn't happen. The fire escape rattled under their feet as they descended swiftly into the narrow alley. The city was alive around them, but Lina's focus was entirely on the task at hand. She had no time to stop, no time to breathe. The danger hadn't passed. It was only growing closer. James, his breathing still heavy from the adrenaline, followed closely behind her, his eyes scanning the shadows, alert for any movement. He was no longer the detached CO he once was. He was a man running for his life, and for the first time, he wasn't in control. Lina's every move was decisive, calculated. He had learned to trust her without question. She wasn't just protecting him, she was saving him. "Where are we going?" James asked, his voice urgent, but with a tinge of disbelief. He was trying to process everything that had happened, but it was too much, too fast. "We need to get off the streets," Lina replied, her voice steady but edged with tension. "There's a place I know nearby, a safe spot." James didn't question her. They had been moving through the city's labyrinthine alleyways for what felt like hours, never staying in one place for too long. Every turn, every step, was calculated. The danger was real, and they were constantly looking over their shoulders. "How much farther?" he asked, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Not far," she said, glancing around the corner of the alley. "We'll be safe soon." But as they reached the next intersection, Lina's instincts flared. She stopped abruptly, her body tensing. James, too, froze, his eyes meeting hers in a silent question. Lina raised a finger to her lips, signaling for him to stay quiet. She peered around the corner, her sharp eyes scanning the street. Her heart skipped a beat. There, in the distance, was the unmistakable black SUV, parked inconspicuously at the curb. It was watching the alley. She cursed under her breath. They had been spotted again. "They're on to us," Lina whispered, her voice barely audible. "Get ready." James's eyes widened in realization. The SUV had come for them, and they couldn't afford to stay where they were. They had to move. "Come on," Lina urged, grabbing his arm and pulling him into the nearest side street. They were now running, moving as quickly and quietly as they could through the darkened alleyways, their footsteps barely making a sound on the wet pavement. The sound of the SUV's engine starting up echoed in the distance, signaling that their time was running out. They had to lose them, and fast. As they reached another junction, Lina glanced over her shoulder and spotted the SUV following them. It wasn't just one vehicle anymore. Another black car had joined the pursuit. They were being boxed in. "We need to get off the streets," Lina said again, urgency in her voice. "There's a subway entrance just ahead. We can lose them underground." James didn't hesitate this time. He trusted her completely. The subway entrance was a few hundred feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. They had to move fast. They pushed forward, ducking into the shadows as the sound of the two vehicles grew louder. The SUV's headlights flashed down the alley, illuminating their path. They were getting closer. "Almost there," Lina said, her voice strained. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had to get them to safety, but the pressure was mounting. They were close, but they weren't in the clear yet. As they reached the stairs leading down to the subway, Lina grabbed James's arm again, pulling him toward the entrance. They descended quickly, the sounds of the city above them fading as they moved deeper into the underground. The dim light from the subway station illuminated the darkened stairwell. James's heart pounded in his chest as they reached the platform. They weren't out of danger, not yet. The subway was crowded with late-night commuters, but there was no guarantee that the men chasing them wouldn't find them here. "Do you think we've lost them?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lina didn't answer immediately. She was scanning the crowd, her eyes darting from person to person, looking for any signs of trouble. The train pulled into the station with a screech of metal against metal. She grabbed James's arm and pulled him toward the doors. "We're getting on the next train," she said firmly, "and we're going to make sure they don't find us." They boarded the train quickly, slipping into a crowded car. Lina chose a seat in the middle, her back to the door, so she could keep an eye on everything. She kept her face low, her eyes scanning the station through the window. The train doors closed, and they were moving, speeding away from the danger they had narrowly escaped. But as the train picked up speed, Lina couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't lost their pursuers yet. She had no idea who these people were or why they wanted James dead, but one thing was certain: they weren't going to give up that easily. The train rattled along the tracks, and Lina's mind raced. She had to stay one step ahead, keep James safe. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. But, for now, at least, they were on their way to safety. The train rumbled down the tracks, its rhythmic clatter providing a strange sense of calm amidst the chaos that had followed them. James sat quietly across from Lina, the weight of everything that had happened pressing heavily on him. He had barely had time to process what was going on. One moment, he was preparing for an important business meeting, and the next, he was running for his life, saved only by the quick instincts of a waitress who seemed to know more about danger than anyone he'd ever met. He glanced at her now, watching as she kept her head low, her eyes scanning the crowd, as if she was constantly searching for threats. She was calm, composed, but James could see the tension in her shoulders. She was alert, ready for anything. That calm was a stark contrast to how he felt. Anxiety gnawed at him, and his mind raced with questions. Who was behind all of this? Why had they targeted him? He'd always known there would be risks that came with his success, but this felt different. This wasn't just a hostile takeover or a business rival trying to undermine him. This was personal. Lina, James said quietly, his voice breaking through the silence. Who were they? Who's trying to hurt me? Lina didn't look at him immediately. She seemed to consider his question, weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. I don't know yet. But whoever they are, they're not just after your company. They want something more. James sat back, processing her words. More? What could they possibly want that was beyond his wealth or his business? He had no family to speak of, no one who could be used against him. There were no obvious targets, no leverage that could be used to manipulate him. Yet, something about Lina's words didn't sit right with him. He had been targeted. He had no doubt about that. But why? What are you thinking? James asked, his voice tinged with frustration. I don't know what's going on, but I can't keep running forever. I need answers. I need to know who's behind this. Lina turned her gaze to him, her eyes sharp and focused. I know you're used to being in control, James. But right now, the best thing you can do is let me handle this. We're not out of danger yet. Whoever's chasing us is relentless. She paused for a moment, glancing at the subway map above them, as if checking their route. I'll figure it out, she said, her voice low and steady. But we need to stay low for a while, stay out of sight. We don't know if they've alerted other people or if this is just the beginning of something much bigger. James nodded slowly. He didn't like it, but he understood. He'd spent his life building his empire on making calculated moves, taking control of his destiny, and never letting anyone dictate his actions. But right now, he had no choice but to trust this woman who had come out of nowhere and turned his world upside down. The train's lights flickered as it slowed to a stop, the sudden shift pulling James out of his thoughts. They had reached their destination, the train station they needed to get off at. As the doors opened, Lina was already on her feet, pulling James along with her. She was quick, decisive, and James followed her instinctively, trusting her judgment. The station was relatively quiet, the late hour keeping most of the usual commuters away. As they moved through the crowd, Lina kept a sharp eye on their surroundings, glancing over her shoulder every now and then. James couldn't help but notice how out of place he felt. He was used to the glitzy, high-profile events, to the attention and the privilege. But now, he was just another person in the crowd, trying to blend in, trying to avoid detection. They reached the exit, and Lina led him down a dark alleyway that led to an old apartment building. This is where we're going to lay low for the night, she said as they approached the entrance. James frowned, glancing around. It didn't look like the kind of place he'd usually visit. The building was run down, the kind of place he'd avoid if he was walking the streets in broad daylight. But at this moment, it was exactly what they needed. You're sure it's safe? He asked, his voice filled with hesitation. As safe as we can get for now, Lina replied. She gave him a look that told him not to question her further, and with a deep breath, James followed her inside. The building's hallways were dimly lit, the floors creaking underfoot. They passed several doors, all closed and quiet. No one seemed to be around. Lina led him up a flight of stairs, her pace steady and controlled. James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but there was no sign of anyone following them. They reached the top floor, and Lina knocked on a door. A few moments later, it opened, revealing a man who appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He nodded at Lina, then looked at James with curiosity, but said nothing. This is James, Lina said briefly. He's staying for the night. The man didn't question it. He simply stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The apartment was modest, a far cry from the luxury James was used to, but it was clean and comfortable. A small kitchen sat off to one side, and the rest of the space was sparsely furnished with a few chairs and a couch. You'll be fine here, Lina said, as she moved toward the window to check the view. I'll make sure we have a plan by tomorrow. James looked around the room, his thoughts swirling. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, or if they would be safe even then. But for now, this small, unremarkable apartment was the only place he could go. The apartment was quiet now, the only sound the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. James sat on the worn couch, his mind racing, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. He had gone from being a successful CEO, wrapped up in the world of business deals and power plays, to being a fugitive, running through the streets, chased by unknown enemies. He had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was certain. He couldn't go back to his life before. Not after this. Lina moved around the apartment, her movements deliberate, purposeful. She had been quiet since they arrived, taking quick glances at the windows, checking the locks on the doors. She was always on alert, always watching. It was a strange feeling for James. He wasn't used to being in a position where he couldn't control everything, where he had to rely on someone else for his safety. He had been a man of action, always several steps ahead of everyone else. But tonight, he had been the one caught off guard. What now? James finally asked, breaking the silence. Lina paused, turning toward him. We wait for now, she said, her voice calm but firm. We need to let things settle down before we make any moves. James didn't like the sound of that. Waiting had never been his style. He preferred to take action, to make decisions, to control the situation. But right now, he had no choice but to trust her. She had saved his life twice now, and she was the only reason he wasn't lying in a hospital or worse. Do you know who's behind this? He asked. Lina shook her head. Not yet, she said. But I will. I have people looking into it. James leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You have people? Who are you? He asked. There was no judgment in his voice, just genuine curiosity. Lina smiled slightly, her eyes narrowing just a touch. Let's just say I have a network of people I can rely on, she said. I've dealt with things like this before. It's not the first time I've had to keep someone safe. James blinked, taken aback by the admission. He had assumed Lina was just a waitress, someone with no connection to his world. But now he wasn't so sure. There was something about her, something that didn't add up. He wanted to ask more, to know exactly who she was, but something told him to wait. There was no point in pushing her. He had more important things to worry about. How long are we staying here? He asked instead, glancing around the small apartment. It was modest, nothing like the luxury penthouse he was used to, but it was functional, and right now, that was all that mattered. Just tonight, Lina replied, moving toward the kitchen area. Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next step. James nodded. He had no idea what she had planned, but he trusted her. He had to. The alternative was too dangerous. As the night wore on, they both remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. James couldn't help but replay the events of the night in his head. The driver's hesitation, the SUV following them, the feeling of being hunted. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, that he was never truly alone anymore. The weight of the situation pressed on him, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. But despite the fear, there was a strange comfort in having Lina nearby. She was calm, composed, and she always seemed to know what to do. It was something he didn't have anymore. Control. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one who called the shots. But now, he was at the mercy of the unknown. It was a humbling experience, and one he wasn't sure he was ready for. Lina returned to the living room after a few minutes, her gaze fixed on the window. We need to move soon, she said, her tone serious. James looked up, startled. Move? Where? To a safer location, Lina replied. I don't know how long we can stay here before someone figures out where we are. James swallowed. The reality of the situation was setting in. He was running, and he didn't know where to. He didn't know who he could trust. But he knew one thing. He had to keep moving. He couldn't afford to be caught. How do we know when it's safe? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lina turned to face him, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp with determination. We don't, she said. But we'll keep moving until we find a place that is. James didn't say anything. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say. The world he had known was gone, and now, he was just trying to survive. The city outside seemed so far away now, its lights a distant memory of a life he couldn't return to. But for now, all he could do was follow Lina, trust her, and hope that somehow, she would lead him to safety. Lina and James stepped out into the cold night air, the weight of the world pressing down on both of them. They had barely spoken since their arrival at the small, cramped apartment, each lost in their own thoughts. The silence was thick, heavy with the unspoken understanding that their lives had changed forever. There was no going back to the way things were before. For the first time in a long while, James felt a deep sense of vulnerability. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, but now, everything fell out of his hands. Lina, on the other hand, seemed calm, focused. Her eyes were constantly scanning their surroundings, as if she was waiting for something to happen. James watched her, noting the steely determination in her posture. She had been his savior, his protector, and yet, she remained an enigma. Who was she really? What was her past? He had no answers, but one thing was certain, he had to trust her. What's the plan now? James asked, breaking the silence. His voice sounded strained, worn from the constant tension that had been building inside him for hours. Lina didn't answer immediately. She kept walking, her pace steady, her eyes moving from side to side, as if she were evaluating every person, every corner. We move, she said simply. We keep moving until we're out of danger. James wasn't sure what that meant, but he didn't question it. He had learned to follow her lead, even when it felt like they were walking blindly into the unknown. The city stretched out before them, its lights twinkling in the distance. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few scattered pedestrians making their way home after a long day. They blended into the shadows, trying not to draw attention to themselves. How much longer do we have before they find us? James asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. Lina glanced at him, her expression unreadable. I don't know, she said. But we have to stay one step ahead. If they're after you, they won't stop. Not until they have what they want. The weight of her words hit James like a brick. Whoever was chasing him was relentless, and the thought of being pursued without end was almost too much to bear. But as long as Lina was by his side, he felt like there was a chance. And what exactly do they want? James asked, his mind racing. I can't tell you for sure yet, Lina replied, her voice low. But I've seen this before. Whoever's behind this is looking for something more than just money. It's personal, and that means they won't stop until they get it. James felt a chill run down his spine. What could be more personal than his wealth? What had he done to make someone want to hurt him this badly? We need to find out who's behind this, James said, his voice firm. We can't keep running forever. Lina stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him pause. We'll find out, she said, her voice quiet but filled with determination. But for now, we need to keep you safe. That's our only priority. James nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. He wanted answers, but for now, survival had to come first. They walked in silence for a few more blocks, the sounds of the city filling the air around them. James couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Every car that passed seemed like it could be the one that would stop them. Every person on the street felt like a potential threat. He couldn't escape the feeling that they were being watched. We're almost there, Lina said, breaking the silence. They had reached a nondescript building in a quieter part of the city. The building looked old, the kind of place you might pass by without a second glance. But to James, it was a lifeline. This is it, he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. For now, Lina replied, giving him a sharp look. Stay close. We're going in, and we're staying low. James followed her inside, his nerves on edge as they made their way up a flight of stairs to the second floor. The building was old, the floors creaking beneath their feet. Lina led him to a door at the end of the hallway, knocking 3 times in quick succession. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a man who looked to be in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a stern expression. Lina, the man said, his voice gruff. You've got him. We need a safe place for the night, Lina said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. James followed her, feeling a sense of unease settle over him. The man didn't say anything at first, just stepped aside to let them in. You're lucky to be alive, he said, his voice gruff. But you're not out of the woods yet. James nodded, glancing at Lina, who had already moved to the window, scanning the streets below. We'll keep you safe here, the man said, his eyes narrowing. But you can't stay here long. We need to figure out who's behind this and take them out before they do any more damage. James felt a surge of frustration. Who is this person? He asked. Why are they after me? The man sighed, his eyes flicking to Lina. She turned, her expression hard. It's complicated, she said, her voice low. But we'll figure it out. One step at a time. James could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. He was no longer in control of his own life. But as long as he had Lina by his side, he knew he wasn't completely powerless. He could survive this. He had to. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the city outside. James had barely slept, his mind racing with questions and uncertainties. He was used to being in control, used to knowing exactly what was happening at all times. But now, everything was out of his hands. He had never imagined a situation like this, a night spent hiding, uncertain of who was after him or why. He paced the small room, unable to sit still. Lina had remained calm the entire time, but that only made James more uneasy. It was as if she was hiding something, though he didn't know what. She had saved his life twice now, and he had no doubt that she was the only reason he was still breathing. But who was she really? "You should rest," Lina said from the corner of the room, her voice steady as always. She had been sitting in the shadows, her eyes scanning the area, ever vigilant. "We have a lot to do tomorrow." James stopped pacing and looked at her. "What do you mean, a lot to do?" Lina stood up, her movements fluid, efficient. "We need to find out who's behind this and why they're targeting you," she said. "We can't keep running forever." James knew she was right, but the thought of going on the offensive, of finding the people behind this, filled him with dread. What if they were even more dangerous than he imagined? What if it was already too late? He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was after him was always one step ahead. He glanced at Lina, his mind racing with questions. How do we even start? How do we know who they are? Lina's gaze didn't waver. "We start by finding out where they're operating from," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of steel beneath it. "We track their movements, their patterns. Someone will slip up." James looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. "And what if they find us first?" he asked quietly. "What then?" "Then we fight back," Lina replied simply, her expression hardening for the first time. "We don't run anymore." The finality in her voice sent a shiver down James's spine. He wasn't used to being backed into a corner, and yet here he was, relying on someone else's instincts to survive. It was humbling, and not in a way he was comfortable with. But there was something about Lina, something about the way she handled herself, the way she saw the world, that made him believe they might just have a chance. He nodded slowly, his thoughts racing. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he admitted. "I've spent my whole life building this company, this empire. Now it's all falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." Lina's gaze softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "You don't have to fix it," she said. "You just have to survive long enough to understand it. We'll figure this out, one step at a time." Her words, simple as they were, brought a sense of clarity to James. She was right. He didn't have to fix everything. All he had to do was survive. For now, that was enough. "All right," he said, his voice steadier than before. "What's the first step?" Lina turned and headed toward the door. "First, we need to make contact with someone who can get us more information. Someone on the inside." James followed her, his mind still spinning. "And who exactly is this person?" Lina's eyes flicked over her shoulder. "There's someone I trust," she said simply. "And if they can help us, we'll move forward. If not, we keep looking." James wasn't sure how much he trusted Lina's someone, but he didn't have many options. He had to go along with her plan. As they left the apartment, the chill of the night air hit James. He hadn't realized how much time had passed since they'd arrived. The city outside seemed so normal, so untouched by the chaos he was now living. The noise of traffic, the murmur of voices, it all felt so far removed from his new reality. But he couldn't dwell on that now. He had to focus. Lina led him through the streets, her pace quick and determined. James kept pace with her, still unsure of where they were headed, but trusting her to lead the way. They walked in silence for several blocks, the tension between them palpable. James could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wanted to ask more questions, to learn more about Lina, but something told him it wasn't the right time. She wasn't ready to reveal anything yet, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it. After what felt like an eternity, Lina stopped in front of a small, inconspicuous cafe. "This is where we meet," she said, glancing around to make sure they weren't being watched. James hesitated, his instincts telling him that something about this felt off. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Lina gave him a quick, reassuring look. "I'm sure," she said. "Now let's go." They entered the cafe, the bell above the door ringing softly as they stepped inside. The warm scent of coffee filled the air, but James wasn't fooled. He could feel the tension in the room. Lina led him to a table in the corner, where a man was sitting, his face obscured by a newspaper. As they approached, he lowered the paper, revealing a face James didn't recognize. "You're late," the man said in a low voice, his tone cold. "I don't like to be kept waiting." Lina didn't respond, just sat down across from him, her eyes locking onto his. James took a seat next to her, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment where everything changed. The man across the table from James and Lina didn't speak immediately, his cold eyes scanning James with the practiced disinterest of someone who had dealt with far too many high-profile people in his life. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Lina didn't flinch. She sat there with the same calm composure that had guided her through every moment since they had met. Her gaze was steady, never wavering from the man in front of them. James, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being tested. His mind raced with questions. Who was this person? Why had Lina brought him into this? The man finally folded his newspaper, setting it down with a soft thud on the table, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward slightly. "So," he said, his voice smooth but clipped, "Lina tells me you've stirred up quite a mess." James remained silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His instincts told him to be cautious. "I don't know what you've been told," James replied, his voice steady. "But I didn't ask for any of this. I just want to know who's after me and why." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by James's statement. "You think I'm just going to tell you all the answers?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, do you?" James's jaw clenched. "I'm not here to play games," he said. "I want to know who's behind this." The man smiled slightly, a knowing, almost amused smile. "Of course you do. Everyone wants answers when they're backed into a corner. But here's the thing, James. Answers come with a price. Nothing is free, especially not in a world like this." Lena's eyes flicked to the man, her expression unreadable. James could tell that whatever this was, whatever deal they were about to make, it wasn't going to be simple. "What do you want?" Lina asked, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it now. The man looked at her, his gaze sharp. "I want information," he said, his tone cold. "The people after James? They're not amateurs. This isn't just about money or power. It's about something much deeper, something that goes far beyond what either of you understand." James felt a chill settle over him. He had suspected as much. Whoever was after him wasn't just after his wealth or his business. There was something personal at play. But what? What's this really about? James asked, leaning forward slightly. The man's gaze never left him, but there was a flicker of something dark, in his eyes. "I don't know if I can give you all the answers you're looking for," he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "But I can tell you this. You've pissed off the wrong people. And now, you've got a choice to make." James's stomach tightened. This was it, the moment where everything changed. "What choice?" he asked. The man leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as if he were about to impart some great secret. "You can keep running. You can hide, hope to survive. But the longer you run, the tighter the noose gets." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Or, you can help me. Help me get to the heart of this mess, and I'll make sure you're not just another target." James stared at him, trying to process what he had just heard. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about becoming part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. He didn't know if he could trust this man, or even Lina, for that matter, but it seemed like his only option. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady, though his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The man's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I need you to dig deeper. Find out who's pulling the strings. Because let me tell you, James, the people behind this aren't just going to stop with you." He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "They're coming for everything. And if you want to survive, you're going to have to fight back. But not just with your usual tactics. This time, you'll need to think smarter." Lina stayed quiet, watching the exchange carefully. James could feel her eyes on him, but for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could trust her completely. Had she known this all along? Had she brought him here to make a deal with this man, or was there something more at play? He glanced at her, but she didn't give anything away. "How do you know all of this?" James asked, his voice low. The man chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "I've been around a long time," he said. "I know the game, and I know when someone like you is in over their head." He stood up abruptly, his eyes never leaving James. "I'll help you, but don't mistake this for charity. You're going to owe me. James's mind raced. He was being pulled into something much bigger than he had ever expected. Fine, he said, his voice firm. I'll do whatever it takes. But I need to know exactly who I'm dealing with. The man nodded slowly, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. You'll get your answers, James. But be careful. The deeper you dig, the more you'll find. And trust me, you don't want to know everything. The man turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before he left. Don't make me regret this, he said. With that, he was gone. James sat there for a moment, letting everything sink in. He had no choice but to follow the path ahead. But the more he learned, the more he realized how little he truly understood. The fight for survival was just beginning, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was to come next. The silence in the room was thick, pressing down on James as he sat there, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. The man had left without a word, and now James was alone with Lina. He could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't look up. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the pieces of this growing puzzle. He had come so far from his old life, and now he was tangled in a web of danger and uncertainty. The man who had just left had said it himself. Whoever was after him wasn't going to stop. And now, it seemed like James had no choice but to join the fight. So what now? James asked, his voice hoarse. Lina didn't answer immediately. She stood near the window, her eyes scanning the dark streets below. She was always vigilant, always watching. James didn't understand how she could be so calm in the face of all this. We start digging, she said finally, her voice steady. We start by finding out who's behind this, and we move forward from there. James nodded slowly. He had no idea what it meant to dig in a situation like this. He was used to business negotiations, mergers, acquisitions, not covert operations or trying to stay alive. How do we even begin to find them? He asked. Lina turned to face him, her eyes sharp with focus. We go to the people who know the truth. The ones who can give us the information we need. And who are they? James asked, raising an eyebrow. Lina's expression didn't change. People I trust, she said simply. She didn't elaborate, but James could tell by the look in her eyes that this wasn't going to be easy. The more he learned about Lina, the more he realized how little he actually knew. She was a puzzle, just like everything else in this twisted situation. But there was one thing he was sure of. If anyone could keep him alive, it was her. All right, James said, standing up. Let's do this. He didn't know what he was getting into, but he had no choice now. They couldn't afford to wait. The only way out was forward. Lina nodded and moved toward the door. We'll leave in 10 minutes, she said. Get what you need. We don't know how long we'll be gone. James turned toward his bag, trying to focus on what was important. He grabbed his wallet, his phone, and a few other items he thought he might need. As he did, his mind wandered to the strange, cryptic words the man had said. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was bigger than that. But what could it be? What had he done to bring this kind of danger into his life? He had spent his entire career building his empire. He had worked hard for every inch of success. And now, it felt like everything was crashing down around him. As he finished gathering his things, he glanced over at Lina. She was ready, her face determined. You all right? She asked, her voice soft but with an edge of concern. James hesitated. He didn't want to admit that he was scared. He was used to being in control, used to having all the answers. But now he had nothing. I'm fine, he said finally, his voice firm. Let's go. Lina gave him a nod, and they left the apartment, moving quickly through the darkened hallways. They stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze hitting James's face like a slap. It was late, the streets quiet, but there was a sense of urgency in the air that kept James's heart racing. They moved quickly, blending into the shadows, staying away from the main streets. Every step felt like it could be their last. James's mind kept drifting back to the words of the man they had just met. You're not out of the woods yet. What did he mean by that? Were they being watched right now? Were they being set up? He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The city felt vast, but it felt small too. There were eyes everywhere. As they turned a corner, Lina stopped suddenly, her body stiffening. James froze, his heart leaping in his chest. Had they been spotted? He looked around, but there was no one in sight. What is it? He whispered. Lina's eyes were scanning the street ahead, her body tense. She was still listening for something, waiting for a sound. After a long moment, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. We're not the only ones moving through this city tonight, she said quietly. I can feel it. We need to get out of here. Now. James didn't hesitate. He trusted her, even if he didn't fully understand what was going on. They turned and headed down another alley, moving faster now, pushing themselves to cover more ground. The air seemed thicker now, heavier with the weight of whatever was closing in on them. They had no choice but to keep moving. The only thing James knew for sure was that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about survival. His survival. And Lina's. They continued moving through the darkened streets, the shadows of the city swallowing them whole as they kept their pace steady. James could feel the tension building, a quiet, unspoken anxiety pressing in on him from all sides. Every sound, every movement, felt amplified in the stillness of the night. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but there was no one following them. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Lina, however, was unshaken. Her focus remained sharp, her eyes scanning the streets with precision as they walked, leading the way without hesitation. She had her own radar for danger, and James knew that if there was anything out of place, she would catch it in an instant. It was strange, though. He hadn't seen her let her guard down even for a second since they'd met. Everything she did seemed calculated, each move made with purpose, but tonight, he felt like they were getting closer to something. The air around them felt charged, like they were headed straight into the unknown. Lina, James finally spoke, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the last several minutes. Where are we going? She didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her voice was steady, though there was a slight edge to it. A safe place, but we'll need to move fast once we get there. He raised an eyebrow, noticing the urgency in her words. And what exactly is waiting for us there? He asked, still unsure of who or what they were dealing with. She glanced over her shoulder at him, her expression unreadable. Information, she said simply. The kind that could give us the answers we need. James's curiosity piqued. And who exactly is this person? She didn't answer at first. Instead, she led him down a narrow alley, moving quickly. The city had a way of feeling empty in the late hours of the night, but at the same time, there was always a lurking sense of danger, of eyes watching from the dark. Someone I trust, she said quietly. They've helped me in the past, and they're the only one who might have the information we need to make a move. James didn't push her further. He had learned that when Lina spoke, it was best to listen. She didn't give away much, but he trusted her more than anyone else right now. As they reached the end of the alley, Lina stopped, and James nearly walked into her back. She raised a hand, signaling for him to stay still. He froze, eyes widening as he glanced around. What was going on? She held up a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. James could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Lina's eyes narrowed, and she moved to the side of the building, pulling James with her. They stood there, pressed against the cold stone, holding their breath, as the footsteps grew louder. From the darkness emerged a figure, a man in a long coat, walking with purpose. James's heart raced as the figure passed by, unaware of their presence. The man didn't look their way, and he didn't seem to be looking for anyone in particular. But Lina's grip tightened on James's arm, and he could feel the tension in her muscles. She was ready. James couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They hadn't been followed by anyone directly since they left the apartment, but there was no guarantee they hadn't been spotted already. They had to keep moving, keep their heads down. The city was too dangerous at this point. What now? James whispered. Lina motioned for him to follow, and they moved again, this time keeping low and sticking to the shadows. As they walked, the feeling of being hunted never left James. His mind kept racing, trying to piece together the puzzle of why he was being targeted. But nothing made sense. He hadn't done anything out of the ordinary to deserve this, had he? He was just a businessman, just a man trying to build something for himself. But whoever was after him didn't care about his success. They were after something else. What could it be? As they turned another corner, Lina led James toward a small building tucked away in a quieter part of the city. It was old, nondescript, and entirely unremarkable. But to James, it felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could hide for a while. They entered the building, the door creaking slightly as it opened. Inside, the place was dimly lit, with old furniture scattered around. The scent of stale air and dust filled the space, but there was something oddly comforting about it. It felt like a place that time had forgotten. Stay close, Lina whispered, her voice low. We can't risk being seen. James nodded and followed her into the building. As they moved further inside, Lina stopped in front of a door at the back of the room. She knocked twice, paused, then knocked again. A moment later, the door creaked open. Inside stood a woman, her face partially hidden by the dim light, but her eyes sharp and calculating. Lina, the woman said, her voice smooth, almost like velvet. I see you've brought company. Lina nodded, but her posture remained stiff. We need answers, she said firmly. And you're the only one who can give them to us. The woman's gaze flicked over to James, taking him in with a single, assessing look. You've been causing trouble, she said, her tone unreadable. But trouble always has a way of finding us. James couldn't help but feel like he was stepping deeper into a world he didn't understand. He had no idea who this woman was, or what her connection to Lina was. But right now, he had no choice but to trust her. Do you have the information we need? Lina asked, her voice unwavering. The woman smiled faintly, then stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Come in, she said. We have much to discuss. The woman motioned for them to sit, her expression unreadable as she closed the door behind them. The room they entered was modest, its furnishings old but sturdy. There were bookshelves lined with thick volumes, and a single desk illuminated by a dim lamp. The woman took a seat behind the desk, folding her hands neatly in front of her. James and Lina sat across from her, neither of them speaking as they waited. The silence stretched on, and James could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. He wasn't sure what to expect, but something about the woman made him uneasy. She was calm, too calm for a situation like this. So, the woman said finally, her voice breaking the silence. You've come for answers. Her eyes flicked between James and Lina, her gaze piercing, almost as if she could see right through them. You want to know who's after you, she continued, her tone flat. And why? James nodded, his throat dry. He had spent the last few hours in a whirlwind of confusion, uncertainty, and fear. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening and why his life had been turned upside down. Yes, he said, his voice firm, despite the unease that settled in his chest. I need to know who's behind this. The woman leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the surface of the desk. I'll tell you what I know, she said. But understand this. Information comes at a price. Lina shifted in her seat, but didn't say anything. James could feel her tense beside him. She had warned him about the cost of these answers, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. What's the price? He asked, his voice steady but with a hint of apprehension. The woman smiled faintly, a cold, almost calculating expression. In this world, you don't get something for nothing, she said. The price is always steep, whether you realize it or not. She paused, her eyes narrowing as if she was assessing James's readiness. But I'll give you what I can. There's a group, a very powerful group, that's been targeting you. They're not just after your business. They're after something else. Something much bigger. James's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? He asked, leaning forward in his seat. The woman's gaze never wavered. I don't know all the details, she admitted. But I know enough to tell you that this goes beyond money. Or power. It's personal. James's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented information. Who are they? He asked. The woman paused for a moment, as if considering her words carefully. They're not just criminals. They're connected to something much older, much deeper. A shadow organization, one that operates outside the law, with its own agenda. James felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was worse than he had imagined. Whoever was after him wasn't just some random group of criminals or corporate rivals. They were part of something much more dangerous, something he had no way of understanding. So what do we do now? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman leaned forward, her eyes fixed on him. You keep moving, she said. You stay one step ahead. You don't let them get to you. And you find out more about who they are. And how do we do that? Lina spoke for the first time, her voice calm but laced with determination. The woman studied her for a moment before responding. I'll give you a contact, she said. Someone who can help you. But you have to be careful. This person is well placed, but they're not immune to danger. Who is it? James asked. The woman hesitated before answering. I can't give you their name, but they work in the shadows. They know things that most people don't, and they can give you the information you need. But you have to trust them. Trust is everything in this world. James's mind raced again. He wasn't sure he could trust anyone right now. He had no idea who to believe, who was on his side, and who was lying. But he didn't have a choice. If he wanted to survive, he had to follow through. All right, James said, his voice firm. We'll do it. We'll find this person and get the information we need. The woman stood up, moving toward the door. Good, she said, her tone final. But remember, you're not just fighting for your life anymore. You're fighting for something bigger. This is bigger than just you. As the door opened, James stood up as well, his mind still racing with the gravity of the situation. Lina stood beside him, her face expressionless, but he could feel the weight of her presence. She was in this with him, no matter what came next. I'll be in touch, the woman said, her voice cold as she stepped out of the room. The door closed behind her, and James and Lina were left alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of the world bearing down on them. They had their first lead, but they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Whatever they were about to face, James wasn't sure if he was ready. But he had no choice. The fight for his life was only just beginning. Discover the gripping journey of survival and trust in this series of touching stories. Follow James, a once powerful CEO, as he navigates through a world of danger and deception after becoming the target of a mysterious group. With the help of Lina, a woman with a hidden past, James must uncover the truth behind the threats to his life, while trying to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. These touching stories unfold in the dark corners of the city, where danger lurks at every turn, and alliances are formed under the most unlikely circumstances. As James and Lina work together to unravel the mystery, they are faced with choices that could change their lives forever. With each step, they uncover shocking secrets and face the harsh realities of a world where trust is hard to come by. In these touching stories, the stakes are high, and the journey is anything but predictable. Through twists and turns, they must decide who to trust and how far they are willing to go for survival. These touching stories show how even in the most perilous situations, the bonds between people can be the difference between life and death. Will James and Lina find the answers they need, or will the shadows consume them? Don't miss out on these emotionally charged, touching stories filled with suspense, action, and unexpected revelations.